Hi there, and welcome to the podcast Life as a show intently focused on exploring and unearthing the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. If you were to ask what makes human beings distinct as compared to other living organisms, you might say it's our unique ability to experience complex emotions like empathy, jealousy, regret, pride, and so on. These feelings are unmistakably associated with the human experience. However, one of the other identifying markers of what makes us special would surely have to be our ability to communicate. Between our capacity to pick up complex languages, each imbued with their own unique idiosyncrasies, and then to use this verbal coding in ways that ultimately build relationships, societies, and pathways to the advancement of our species, it is not an understatement to say that communication truly is the backbone of our existence. Now, this is not to say that we are without fault when it comes to getting our ideas across to one another. We're also quite skilled and adept at absolutely dropping the ball when it comes to communication. This, however, is where my guest today comes in. David Wagner is a senior advisor, media, and crisis communication expert. He is widely acknowledged as one of Asia's leading authorities on media, crisis, and business communication skills. Over the past 30 years, David has coached over 30,000 trainees, including presidents, CEOs, ambassadors, top government officials, and even billionaires on communicating persuasively in business and managing the media through effective message delivery. He has conducted over 4,000 workshops for over 550 plus organizations for firms including Goldman Sachs, Oracle, Johnson & Johnson, Singapore Airlines, and Wal-Mart throughout the Asia-Pacific region, the Middle East, and North America. David has lectured extensively on business communications at a number of institutions, including Waseda University in Tokyo and the Institute of Public Administration and Management in Singapore. He is also the author of 24 books in Japan on business communications and language usage with translations in Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. To sum it up, he's the guy you or your company needs when bleep hits the fan. Now, after that last eloquent thought, David, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks very much. Bleep hits the fan. Let's start with that. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought I'd get things started the right way with that. But yeah, I'm really excited to get into this with you today. And the first segment, why don't we just jump right in, is something called Coloring Wikipedia. Now, this is a segment basically which I try to add some zest to otherwise sort of dry explanations of professions. But what I like about this is, aside from just bringing everyone up to speed on what profession is all about, I think it offers kind of a jumping off point for highlighting what's not included, and kind of looking at the smaller hidden intricacies of a profession. So I've got you down here for crisis communication, and I'm just going to read off something from Wikipedia. Does that sound good?
Sure.
All right, here goes. Crisis communication is a subspecialty of the public relations profession that is designed to protect and defend an individual, company, or organization facing a public challenge to its reputation. Crisis communication is aimed at raising awareness of a specific type of threat, the magnitude, outcomes, and specific behaviors to adopt to reduce the threat. Now, I do have an add-on to this definition coming from the Public Affairs Council, an organization which is the leading international association for public affairs professionals. So I'm just going to throw this in as well. So, crisis and issues communication experts are often responsible for managing communication around a range of corporate and crisis situations, including issues, preparedness, and planning activities, partnering with business continuity and crisis management teams on running crisis simulations and handling live crisis responses. There it is, two definitions, a bit of a mouthful, but I suspect it's still probably fairly vague and a bit general. I don't know. What do you think there, David?
I think it's a good summation of basically what crisis communication is involving, and it is all about reputation management. In the middle of a crisis, an organization, a company wants to make sure that they have a life after the crisis. And so that's what crisis preparation is all about, managing it well. There's all kinds of crises. A lot of them are very predictable. If you're in the food business, you know that food poisoning can happen. If you're in an airline business, you know that it can crash. So a lot of the crisis that we encounter in the world is predictable. What's going on in Ukraine right now with Russia is very unpredictable, but it's another form of a crisis. And even in a war scenario, there are certain things that you know can and might happen. Mm-hmm. So I think it's highly unlikely that organizations can't adequately plan in advance. You know, don't buy the umbrella when it's raining. Buy it before you need it. And that's basically the business that I'm in. I spent a lot of time until 2019. I was flying all over the world 30, 40 times a year, going and doing these seminars in different places. And it was really interesting to do because I get to learn a lot in the process of doing these seminars. And I get to create crises. Like I work for an oil company and my mind gets to go in many directions. I get to throw in an ISIS fighter that blew up the rig or something. You know, you get to create these things and test the way in which the team that you're managing in the room is prepared. So it's not just at the end of the day, the engagement with the media, it's building up to the engagement with the media, making sure that the president knows what to do, is the right person for that job, that the head of HR and the head of legal and the head of whatever else in the room is performing well as a leadership team, and that business continuity can sustain itself. Yeah.
Yeah. That sounds absolutely fascinating. I mean, it probably keeps you on your toes as well in terms of coming up with these different scenarios and keeping it fresh.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of organizations, the big ones, have crisis manuals, you know, but rarely in the middle of a crisis do you say, okay, everybody, here's the crisis, let's turn to page 23.
Right,
you know,
exactly.
It doesn't really work that way. There's organizations that have certain protocols that you're supposed to follow, but in a fast-moving crisis, you don't have a lot of time.
Yeah, and probably the ones that are adhering strictly to that manual are the ones that are probably dropping the ball on a number of different fronts. I would just
there's that, but you know, there's crises that are 24 hours a day. You know, they go into different time zones around the world. So the sun is setting in one part of the world and it's rising in another, and it doesn't stop. Like the British Petroleum Gulf of Mexico oil leak, you know, 10 years ago or so. Yeah, that was 24/7. Then you know, a different part of the world would have to take it over and monitor the media 24/7.
Wow. And in the day and age that we live in right now, obviously with social media and all of that amplifying what you're just speaking about, probably it would have been a challenge even 20, 30 years ago with just, you know, the things that you'd said. But again, now with social media, that just must be an absolute monster of a thing.
Well, think about it this way. How many people are there in the world?
Yeah.
8
billion.
8 billion, 7 billion. Yeah, how many cell phones are there? 7 billion. Yeah. So basically the world we live in compared to the past, where the media was controlled by media organizations strictly, everyone's a journalist now. Mm-hmm. If you've got a cell phone and you've got a camera, you can make news. Yeah. And that's really hard to manage. Really hard to manage. Yeah. It's a new paradigm, actually.
Most definitely. And that's something I'm really excited to explore later on in this conversation. Sure. But before we do that, really quickly, getting back to the actual definition there, was there anything that you noticed that was missing? I know you'd said it was a pretty good summation, but was there any aspects of it that just weren't exactly?
There's a lot of things I could talk about, but I think one of the key things is to make sure the right person is in the right role during a crisis. That just because someone's a president doesn't mean they should be the spokesperson. You know, there's certain criteria that I recommend someone meets to be that spokesperson that engages the media. And if your main audience is, for example, here in Japan, Japanese audience, do you want a foreigner speaking English to engage them?
Right.
Probably not.
Right.
So then we need, what if the president is a foreigner from Switzerland? Okay, but he or she doesn't speak Japanese. Well, should you use an interpreter? Okay, well, what kind of interpreter? Male or female? What age group? Yeah. Who are you targeting? Who do Japanese trust? So these are some of the components that, you know, have to go into the thought process. And I was doing a training once for an insurance company. It was interesting. It was an Indian national as the president. And speaking of Switzerland, it was a Swiss male interpreter. Okay. So you've got an Indian national and a Swiss male interpreter. There's no Japanese, even though it was a Japanese incident. And I said, stop. Get rid of this Swiss interpreter. Why? Well, because everyone in Japan is going to say, who is that guy? Why is this Japanese so good? And
Right.
he becomes the focus
Right.
of the crisis. That's
Yeah.
not, the interpreter is supposed to be invisible,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I said, stop, stop, stop. Get me, sorry if this sounds inappropriate these days, PC, but get me a 50-year-old woman with gray hair. That's what Japanese would like, and that's what they trust, and that's what they
Yeah.
expect.
Well,
So
you can't ignore those cultural factors, right? I mean,
right.
like you said, the way you outlined it is that would be a major faux pas, major oversight if those sort of things weren't being considered.
But people don't think about the visual as well as the verbal, and it is a combination of both, right?
Most definitely.
So even right now, right, I'm looking at the screen and I realize there's this wooden line going through my head. Like, is that smart of me to do? Probably not, but it's my room and I'm a little tired and it's Wednesday afternoon and we're recording.
Right.
But visually, no, it doesn't work. Is there a plant going out of my head?
Yeah.
What's the lighting like?
Yeah.
Does someone have dandruff on their suit? Their glasses on straight?
Right.
All of those things can make a difference in terms of the impact of the image. A lot of it's very easy to determine and predict, but people don't think about it.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely fascinating. All right. Well, why don't we skip on over into the next segment, something called a Q&A discovery. And I've got a few questions here for you.
Sure.
But before we go too deeply into some of these questions I have, I'd really be curious about, what led you into this field. Maybe you could speak to your journey, leading up to where you're at right now.
My journey.
Yeah, your journey.
Well, I first arrived in Japan in January 1982. It was 40 years ago last month. And I was a student at Kansai Gaidai in Osaka studying Japanese and fell in love with Japan like people do when they come here. And it was just 40 years ago, which little side note is interesting. There's about as many foreigners on the streets of Tokyo as there were in those days because of COVID, which is an interesting sort of side note. But I'll skip over a lot of it, but I'm from a training background professionally. And one thing led to another, and I was doing business communication and I wasn't using my brain very much anymore. And I wasn't learning from the people around me. I wasn't growing anymore. So I decided to change my focus and I wanted to do some new things. And one of the things I wanted to do was combine my background with journalism with the media. And so I approached NHK in 1998 about making a TV show on NHK Educational. And lo and behold, they gave me my own show. I had my own TV show here for 2 years.
Wow.
And that was allowing me to then become sort of a Yumeiji and a famous person here. I was stopped on the street and asked for signatures. It was a great experience for a couple of years, but I'm glad it's over. And I used that to transport myself into the next stage, which was working for a PR firm in Tokyo. There was a job opening for a media trainer, which was perfect for me at that time because of my training background, my media background, my journalism background, and my interest in it. And there were 60 applicants. I got the job, and that was 2001. And I've been doing this for about 20 years. I worked for the agency 12, 13 years, and then I went out on my own in 2014. And I've been doing this independently for 7, 8 years now.
Excellent. Quick question. Was this something that you had the bullseye? This is the target that you were going for, or did this sort of just naturally evolve? You just sort of.
Yeah, it's a great question. No, it wasn't it was not like, since I was born, I always wanted to be a media and crisis trainer. No, but it was an evolution of my skill set. I always wanted to build on what I did in the past, but do something new in the future that was stimulating and also paid the bills. And so that's what I did. And then, of course, you develop your own skill set, your own niche, just like you're doing with this podcast or this YouTube channel. And you realize that you're either good at something or you're not good at something. And if you're good with it, you go with it. And I've developed my own methods of training that are really efficient and effective. And I just depend on word of mouth to feed my offers. So it works. Most of my work, I've never advertised. I don't market. It's all someone on the other side of the world recommends me to someone else. And it's even happening now. And I'm working on negotiating a contract in Canada with a firm that wants me to represent them for the whole country of Canada. So It's great opportunity. It's the gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. Also, I'd imagine too that like with this line of work, especially I guess like the crisis management side of things, it's probably a visceral experience. And if you're able to, adeptly sort of guide a company through a situation, that's something that's probably going to stick with the leadership within that organization. And
yeah, but then the leadership changes and you start
true
from
enough.
scratch again. So
True enough.
there's that.
But I guess then too, they move on to a different company, but
Right.
your name is not easily forgotten. And then
That's
here
right.
we go again. The word of mouth comes back around.
That's
So,
right. And, there's probably a lot of media and crisis trainers in the world, and a lot of them are ex-journalists, for example. That's a natural progression for them. But there are not a lot of them in Japan. And I've been able to take advantage of that, particularly in the English language side. There are a lot of Japanese language media and crisis trainers, but there aren't a lot of English. And I probably know all of the ones in English that I compete against. And it's a big market. There's hundreds of thousands of companies, and I don't feel threatened at all. It's a big enough net for everyone to take a fish out of it. And I think also the world has changed in the sense that everyone's looking for efficiency and effectiveness. When you're online with somebody now, as we have been the last 2 years, think about keeping somebody online for a 2-hour session. Like, who gets to sit with the CEO for 2 hours? Nobody gets to sit with the CEO for 2 hours. So you've got to make these sessions so that they see the value in it. And I make it so that there's a lot of self-discovery in these sessions. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but that's what comes.
No, most definitely. Yeah, no, for sure. Okay, well, why don't we jump on into another question here I've got for you. And I have read that crisis management is essentially divided up into 3 different stages. Of course, you have the pre-crisis stage, during, and then post-crisis. Maybe you could kind of break down each of them kind of like in a basic crisis management 101 as far as do's and don'ts, just to kind of bring, not only myself up to speed here, but some of the listeners as well.
Well, that definition is disputable. There are some people that say there are 4 or 5 different levels.
Okay,
and I don't
all
think
right.
there's one way of doing it, actually. But I do think one of the common areas that I find organizations do not follow through with in advance is even something as simple as a vulnerability assessment. Come in and say, where are we weak? Where are we not prepared? Okay, we've got a crisis manual. Well, is it up to date? And do we have our teams that are ready to go? And do we have backup plans? And do we have a backup office? And do we have continuity plans? And so more than the stages, I think it's just a lot of common sense, making sure that you're ready to go. It reminds me of firehouses and firemen and women. They're constantly practicing all the time. They're undoing all the hoses, and they're wrapping the hoses up, and they're climbing buildings and practicing all the time. And that's really what is important to do. And I find most organizations don't do it. And some organizations are prone to crisis more than others, like hotels. Good God, think of what can go wrong in a hotel.
Right. Fire,
food poisoning, kidnapping, murder. I mean, there's so many things that can happen in a hotel. And is your staff ready to go? And it's not just the executive level of the staff. It's even the people that engage with the people that are guests there. Does the front desk know what to say in the middle of a crisis? It's one thing to engage the media and fend them off, but it's another thing face to face with a paying guest. Hey, I saw an ambulance outside. What's going on? Is the staff trained on what they should and shouldn't say? So every crisis is unique in a way. And it is all about reputation management, as I said earlier, and making sure that you can sort of promise in a way that this is not going to happen again. And that's hard to do. But can you promise that the hotel will never have a fire again? No. How about a cruise ship? And the pandemic with COVID, that's made things really interesting. One person tests positive for COVID, the whole ship has to shut down, right?
Entire industry,
which it did. I mean, wow. Cruise industry.
Almost overnight, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's right. And if you bought the shares of some of those Norwegian cruise ships when they were at $1 a share, you've done pretty well. Yeah. So this is another thing too, is sometimes there's sinister forces at work. Where they create the crisis so that the stock does go down, and then they go in and swoop on it. There's all kinds of things that can go on. And again, how can you imagine? Like, there was a food company I did a training for, and there was a yakuza in Kyushu that called them up and said, you killed my cat. My cat ate your cat food and it's dead. I want money. If you don't give me money, I'm going to the media. Oh, okay. What do you do with that? you know.
Yeah. What'd you do with that?
Yakuza would kill the cat. That's pretty creative.
Yakuza would be the Japanese mafia as well for people that
Japanese
aren't
mafia, yeah.
familiar.
Didn't know Japanese mafia had cats.
Yeah.
See what I learned today?
There you
Yeah.
go. There you go.
So it is an interesting world in which we live, and there's no way you can predict everything. But again, as I said earlier, a lot of things are pretty predictable.
Have
You
you, over the course of, I guess, 30, 40 years, doing this or being involved with it, have you noticed an uptick of, I guess, the need to update these manuals, incorporating the technology and
Sure.
technological aspects? I mean,
Oh
that
yeah,
rate of change has just been, it's almost, you could say, exponential, in so
that's
many
right.
different ways. So like, I can only imagine the ramifications that has had on your industry and, professionals like yourself.
That's right. And a lot of the big PR agencies have nothing but nothing dedicated to social media but social media. I mean, there's new wings of industries in the PR world that have developed as a result of this. It's
Yeah.
created a lot of jobs for a lot of people. But a lot of the work I do some of it's with the big companies, right? But they have their own internal PR mechanism. They have their own department. And they've got some of them are so big, they've got their own training internal, right? I work a lot more with the smaller, medium-sized businesses that don't have that capability.
Right.
And some of the seminars I do are for companies that just want to learn the basics. Instead of a specific one for their specific company, they'll send one of their PR team to my public seminars and learn some of the basics, right? So, what I try to do is create simulations as I build their skills up, so that they can start working on multiple levels of logic and multiple scenarios. And what would you do if? And who would be the best spokesperson? And what would their messages be? And how would they deliver them? Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the basics of what I do most of the time.
Okay. It'd be fascinating to hear as well whether or not there's any specific or Japan specific cultural practices. I'm sure there are. Well, they most definitely are, relating to any of these stages of a crisis, whether it be pre, during, post, or so on and so forth.
Well, yes and no is my answer.
Okay.
Give me a context and I might have a more specific answer. But I think in general, what's interesting to me is the mild-mannered Japanese media. The gloves come off when it's a crisis. They'll camp out in front of the company. They'll camp out in front of the president's home. They can be as vicious here as they can be in your or my country, right? So generally, the media here is mild-mannered. It's all about relationships, and it's all about giving background information and developing the story. In a crisis, it's different. It's less about relationships and more about the headlines, as it would be, as you would guess it to be. But I think Japanese journalists, there's some specialists that specialize, for example, in financial journalism, but there's a lot more generalists who move around just in a typical company. Like a typical company ships them around every couple of years, so they become experienced in multiple parts of the business. It's the same kind of thing with a lot of the journalists that we find in Japan. And so you learn very quickly who are the ones that are good and who are the ones you want to avoid. And there's tricky things. I remember a long time ago, this is about 20 years ago, there was, I'm not going to name the institution, but there was a big Western newspaper from the United States that had sent over a new journalist. And that person planted themselves right in the doorway between the outside and the inside of the room where the press conference was happening. So is that journalist in the room, or is he outside of the room? And therefore, if it's off the record, which means it's not supposed to be quoted, and he's not in the room, is that quotable?
Right.
And so what he did is he decided, well, I'm out of the room and I'm going to quote it. And nobody talked to him after that.
Yeah.
So, you can play your games if you want, but if you want to have a long-term relationship here, you do have to play by the rules and play the game,
Yeah. Yeah.
And the thing is, most of the foreign journalists, not all of them here, are here for a limited amount of time, but there's an increasing number that love it here and stay here. You can find them at the Foreign Correspondents Club. Some of them have been here 20 and 30 years now.
Wow.
They get married like you did. They have a family. They don't want to leave because they love Japan for the reasons we love it, and they stay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The 1 year going on 20. Plan.
When you're going 20, I always tell people it starts at 2, then it goes to 4, then it goes to 8, then it goes to 16, then it goes to 32.
Well said. Well
And
said.
the next one is 64. So we'll see if we all make it to 64 years here.
Yeah, yeah. Before we do move on, there's one other thing I wanted to add. Speaking of Japan and Japan-specific experiences, I remember probably within the first 5 years, one of the first kind of culture shock moments for me was related to some media crisis. Now, I can't even remember what it was. All I do recall is I was a young entertainer, and she was in the news. She had done something. There's been some indiscretion, and her way of showing contrition was basically shaving her head. And I think she might have done it, live or something like that. Maybe, I don't know, it could have been on YouTube if that was around at that point, but that was her way of showing, public apology. Now, those types of things, now that I've been here for this amount of time, I mean, it's not so unusual, but from a Westerner's perspective and people who aren't exactly familiar with the Japanese culture, that type of act would definitely come as a bit of a shock or surprise to many, I would think.
I never heard of that. That
really?
comes as a surprise and a shock to me, actually.
Okay.
But there is something that you've touched on, which I've written about. I've written a couple of articles about this in my LinkedIn page, and I call it the empty bow. And it is the Japanese ojigi, the Japanese bow of contrition, moshiwake gozaimasen, we have no excuse for what's happened, which led me to say, well, if you have no excuse for what's happened, why did it happen in the first place? And so I call these kinds of things the empty bow. I've coined the phrase. I'm acknowledged to have created it. And it's not that the bow doesn't have meaning anymore. It's an empty act in a lot of cases. So they're going through the motions because that's what's expected. But if you really look deeply at it, why did this crisis happen in the first place? How did you guys let it happen?
Right.
There's a long list of those kinds of things. One of the best managed crises that I've ever seen here is the 1985 crash of the Japan Airlines jet, killed about 500 people. It was terrible. It was really, really terrible. And I think there were 4 survivors, if I'm not mistaken. But the JAL handled that one really, really well. They were out front. They showed compassion for the victims and the families. They took advertising down. The president took total responsibility. I mean, it was really, really well managed. And then there's lots of examples where they're not well managed. So we can learn from these things, and I always like to learn from others' mistakes because it's pain-free. And when I watch press conferences or I watch people in a crisis, I try to say, well, what are they doing really well? Great. That didn't go so well. I wouldn't have done it that way. And so that's how I keep on my toes, watching, and not only in a crisis but just in media engagement as a whole.
I got another question here, and it's kind of continuing on to this discussion. For you personally, and the amount of time you've had within the industry, what has been the most challenging aspect of it all for you? I'd imagine there's several things that could be difficult, and maybe this is also based on your stage of development personally within the industry. I'm sure that would vary and would alter things, but yeah.
Well, I would just answer that by saying, at this stage, I've been doing this for over 20 years, and it takes a lot to stimulate me now. So what I try to do is when I'm faced with a new opportunity, see if there's some way I can learn something, not only for my career and for the field, but for myself in my life. And there's still room for growth. I think that's sort of a roundabout answer to saying that. How can I help people resolve their problem, and how can I learn from it?
Yeah, it's almost like an ethos then. Yeah,
pretty much. Pretty much. There's very little that surprises me now. I've been through so many of these things, and there's a crisis. I think you're going to ask me about a specific crisis. You gave me the questions in advance.
Let's hold on to that. That's another segment.
But it brings up an interesting point. And you can always tell people that journalists, you can ask them for the questions in advance. But if you really think about it, you get the questions in advance. If they stick to those questions, it's useful. But if they veer off of it and you haven't prepared for it, it doesn't help you so much.
Yeah.
So the list is helpful, and most journalists will not give it to you anyway. Around the world, they won't. But some will, and some editors will allow it to happen, and it helps you prepare.
Yeah.
But I always advise people to think of what's the most difficult thing they could ask you. What are you scared of answering? Let's practice.
Well said. Well said. In relation to that question, I guess if you could maybe go back in time, maybe say within your first couple of years, what was
Mm.
that like for you personally in the beginning? Because it must be, as you said, an evolution, those skills and development, people probably don't walk into that and, you know, owning the world overnight, more or
That's a
less.
great
Like,
question.
yeah, like how
So
was that for you personally, or even speaking to what that might be like for somebody else who's walking into this profession for the first time, the first year per se.
Well, of course, everyone's situation is going to be different. But what happened for me is I'd come out of my two TV shows of NHK and I'd applied for the job at this PR agency in 2001 in Tokyo. And it so happens that that PR agency had only had a media training slash crisis capability for about a year. And the persons that I was replacing gave me about a 3-day transfer of knowledge. That was it. And basically, I went through the program and said, I don't like this. I like this. Let's keep it. This doesn't make sense. We were spending, for example, on a film crew to film each of the media trainings we were doing. We're spending 150,000 yen a pop. That's $1,500
Yeah.
US. And I said, well, we're doing 80 to 100 of these things a year. We're spending $150,000 on a camera crew. I was like, no, I don't think we need to do that. I'll handle the camera. That sounds okay. So it was a matter of just looking at it from basic logic and saying, where are the cost efficiencies? Where can I make this even better, this program? And that's what I did. I
Mm.
self-taught. I self-taught myself, and I was given a long runway. They trusted me, and I made some good decisions. And within 7 years, we were the leading top English training organization for media and crisis in the city of Tokyo. And we were making a ton of money.
Wow.
In fact, for several quarters, my division was the leading gross revenue producer for the entire PR company in
Wow.
Tokyo, right?
You
So
can hang your
we
hat on.
developed a reputation. We had developed a reputation for being like really, really good at what we were doing, and we were probably a little cheaper than the rest of the competition. These trainings can be really expensive. The Dentsus of the world can charge $10,000-$15,000 a session. Some companies can charge more. I attended a training in Sweden where they had a huge budget. They had a $50,000 budget for a 1-day training, but there was a lot of prep work. And with that kind of budget, you can do things like create a newspaper with a false headline on it. So when the people are walking in the morning, and the camera crew's already in the company at 8 a.m., they've got their Starbucks or whatever they're drinking in Sweden. You go, see this headline? The chairman of your company has been involved in a sex scandal. What do you say to that?
That is fun. That is fun.
You can kind of trap them, and you throw them in a room and say, clear your schedules. This is a training. You got cameras in the ceiling watching what they're doing.
Yeah.
You've got cell phones in the room calling them, like, family members and journalists. And so when you have that kind of a budget, it's not all profit. You can use some of it to do really fun things. But most budgets are not like that, especially since 2008 with the financial crisis. People are pretty lean and mean these days.
Yeah, I bet. All right. Well, why don't we jump into this next segment? Speaking of this story, a water cooler story segment, and this is where, I'm going to ask you to take us into a real life crisis scenario, maybe one of the more memorable ones that stood out over the course of your career. And what were some of the lessons that you learned along the way?
Okay, so the one that comes to mind is a volunteer training that I did for the Japanese government. So it was Fukushima, March of 2011, and I had gone away for a couple of weeks because I thought Japan was going to become radioactive, and it almost did. And I came back a couple of weeks later, and I was looking at the press conferences from the Japanese government, and I was like, oh God, this is not good, So I contacted the comms department at the Prime Minister's office, and they contacted the foreign ministry to make sure I wasn't some terrorist. And I volunteered for 3 weeks to analyze all of their press conferences in English and give feedback on each spokesperson, what they were doing right, how did they look, what was their messaging, what's working, what's not working. It was the most single rewarding experience, because most crises, you don't work on it for 3 weeks, right?
Right.
But it was really rewarding to me, mainly because I got a chance to give back to Japan. I didn't want money for that. I wanted to help. And that was my way of helping and volunteering my skill set. So,
Wow.
what did I learn from that? I learned that I already knew. I reinforced my learning, which is that if you've got a great spokesperson, run with it. If you've got people that are wet behind the ears and not very good, don't use them.
Mm.
It's a risk reward issue. And I think in the middle of a crisis where the headlines are changing, the messaging is changing pretty frequently, you need a trusted voice that's a believable person with a believable story.
Yeah.
And that is what you want to target for sure.
Yeah.
So that was a really rewarding experience. Yeah.
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, because again, I was here during that time. I was up in Tokyo at that time actually too. And I recall in those first few days, yeah, like at least on the English side, the communication was not very good. It was awful. It was absolutely terrible. And there's just, confusion was reigning supreme during that time. But I did, I do recollect, and I'm not just, I'm not flattering you here, but I do recall there was a point early on as well where things did shift and they did change, and suddenly things were getting a lot clearer. And I think the public trust.
Well, I hope I had something to do with it.
Yeah, and I think, I think so. And again, I'm not saying this to flatter you, but I think, well,
there was a great spokesperson, Shikata Noriyuki, who was the chief spokesperson for the cabinet, Prime Minister Khan, I believe, at the time. And he is a gifted guy. He's Japan's greatest spokesperson in English, Harvard educated, fluent in English, great diplomatic language, great deliverer of English, and believable, and very smart, packaging his ideas really smoothly. And he was the spokesperson that I contacted, and I'd known him from the past, from interactions with the government. And so he got me in there to let me help. And, the funny thing is, if you look 10 years later, right now, he's the chief spokesperson. He's the cabinet level spokesperson for the Kishida administration.
Okay.
So 10 years later, he's come full circle and he's now running the show.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Really built.
He's a great guy. He's a nice guy and he's a smart guy.
Yeah.
He's
highly
one of
effective too.
Secret media weapons.
Okay. No, that's absolutely interesting, or absolutely fascinating. Really interesting story there. And yeah, quite the experience that must have been. I can only imagine. You'd mentioned typically crises aren't going on for 3 weeks or longer. But that one certainly played out over months and months, even years.
And the lessons I learned are some of the ones you learned, which is never lie.
Yeah.
They lied about the melting of the core reactors for 2 to 3 months. That was not a good strategy. And how did that help them? Well, that really hurt trust between the government and the people of Japan and the people of the world for a long time. And so, I don't know to what degree that's healed. I presume it's healed pretty well. But, the nuclear industry is not the same, even 10 years later now.
Yeah.
And actually, oddly enough, it's probably going to become more popular again because of the cost of oil and the need for cheap energy.
Yeah, true enough.
So we'll see what that does.
Yeah, one other point relating to that, again, it's kind of bringing me back to those moments, but I recall, I myself, I didn't leave the country at that time, but I did return down to Western Japan, which is where my wife's family is from. And of course, at that time, everyone was just glued to the television sets or newspapers and trying to glean as much information and figure things out. And I remember speaking with my father-in-law, my Japanese father-in-law, and the news that he was getting was on a different level than what I had. And at times, it felt as though the information I would get from the foreign press would be a day or two ahead of what he was getting. And this is a man who's quite well educated and quite aware of what's going on a day-to-day basis within Japan. But there was this major disconnect. And, I still will never forget, it'd be a day or two later and you're like, oh, Chris, you called it. Here it is. Here's that news you were talking about. But he would just be dumbfounded by this. And this was somebody who'd grown up, trusting the Japanese government, of course, and all the news and all the communication that had been coming through. And this, I think for him was one of those first moments where he was, I don't know if distrust is the right word. It might be too harsh, but, becoming a little bit more cynical about it. And I think there was this disconnect between, say, the foreign press covering what was unfolding within Fukushima and elsewhere in Japan, and then how the Japanese press was covering it. And yeah, there must have been a lot of lessons learned in that experience
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And trust is the key in anything that we do with the media. It's all about telling a believable story in a trustworthy way. And that's why the spokesperson is key in the equation, making sure that person can walk the walk and talk the talk,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And things you wouldn't think about that can influence people's perception, especially when there's the perception that, she didn't answer the question. Yeah. Well, she didn't answer the question. Why didn't she answer the question? Well, that's because they didn't acknowledge that the question was asked in the first place in the proper way. And if you acknowledge it, that's a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
And then you could go on to other things. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
I do have one more segment. We're going at a pretty good clip here. We're heading around the bend into the last one here, a crystal ball segment. And it is, as it sort of implies, we're looking towards the future here, trends, predictions, so on and so forth. Now, we've kind of spoke about this already, but the pace at which media, has been evolving and ostensibly transforming itself, year in and year out. How do you see yourself, people like yourself in the industry adapting or moving forward? I mean, is this adherence to the traditional pillars of, truth and rules within media and crisis management communication? Are they enough to rely on, or does this playbook need to be updated?
It's a great question. I think it's evolving, but the basics are not changing, which is, tell the truth and never lie.
Yeah. And
don't say too much. You don't, if you think about how much you're quoted in a news clip, it depends on the type of media, right? If it's a YouTube video, it can be 5 hours. But if you're in a newspaper, how long is a quote? How long is it? 1, 2 sentences, maybe?
Yeah.
So
sure.
If you're sitting there talking to a journalist for an hour and they're going to quote 1 or 2 sentences, well, question, Christopher, which 2 sentences are they going to use?
Exactly. In that context.
So that means that everything that you say from the beginning to the end has to have value if that's what they choose to use.
Exactly.
So that's why you want to be brief and concise with what you say so that everything's quotable. And I meet a lot of people that are really, really talkative people. They're talking in, pages and pages of text each answer. It's not quotable. You got to do a paradigm shift with teaching them to be concise. I don't think that's going to change. And we're in a concise world. Look at Twitter. What is it? It used to be 120 characters. Now it's 240, or is it 140? Now it's 280. Something like that.
I think it is second. Yeah, 140.
And so now it's double what it used to be for years. But basically, everyone's into short, concise. Everyone's attention span is minimal.
That's
now,
right. Yeah.
And young people, they're flipping through their cell phones so quickly. They're changing modems, and they're looking at different things quickly. And everyone's attention span is short. So that affects the business that I'm in now. And it means we've got to really have quotable quotes, impactful quotes, and that's what I help people to do.
Okay.
I don't judge the content of what people say. That's not my job.
Of course.
My job is to help them deliver it.
Yeah.
I'm not the one who creates the message. You know what you want to say. I just help you say it better.
That must be tough at times, though. Like the personal side sort of entering in. Well, I guess, of course, the professional side is there, and your role and what you're supposed to be doing, but also just being a human at times, and like knowing that full well that this could be, something that could get twisted around, perhaps.
So there are personal, moral, and ethical limits for myself. Sometimes I've been engaged or potentially engaged by like smoking company, a cigarette company, or a liquor company, or gambling company, and rifle, guns. I have to ask myself if I'll do that. And I was engaged to do a training from a tobacco company some years ago. And I thought, well, look, let's test them and see if it meets my moral and ethical standards. So I asked them the following question: how do you feel knowing that your product produces cancer in the human body? And they said, we're transparent about the potential impact of our product on the human body. And I said, great, I'll work with you.
There you go. Simple as that.
If they gave some other answer that didn't fit,
whitewashed it.
I'm not going to work with them. Right. But it's not for me to judge. When you're dealing with a financial firm, where do they put their money? What do they invest in? Do they invest in gambling? Is that a problem for me? is it a problem for them? You know, I'll ask him questions and I'll say, well, you're involved in gambling and that money is used by gangsters to do X, Y, and Z. How do you feel about that? And so I can have an impact, you know, where I want to, in making people think about not only the message, but what they're doing.
Yeah.
But it's not my job to do that.
Yeah.
I really steer clear of it most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And like during the crisis with Fukushima, I didn't tell them what to say. I'm not going to tell Japanese government what to say. They know what to say.
Yeah.
I'm just going to help them say it better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, some striking thoughts there. And I think just really insightful. It's been really interesting for me to kind of hear this. I mean, again, you can have a surface level understanding of what this industry could be like. But I felt through this conversation, it's been a bit of a journey for myself in terms of uncovering and hearing this, like these inside sort of scoops, if you will. And I'm sure a lot of the listeners as well are going to take away, you know, quite a few gems of knowledge from all of this. So, you know, it's been a stirring talk, and you know, I thank you immensely for coming on today. It's been a lot of fun.
It's been good fun. Thank you, Chris.
Great. Well, for those interested in learning about David and his work, you can find and connect with him on LinkedIn as well as Twitter. And also, too, if you like today's show, please be sure to share. To show further support, you can rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And also, too, not to be forgotten, we just did launch a new YouTube channel, Life as a, where you can go on over there and catch the whole video, audio recordings of talks like this. Finally, don't forget to join us on the next episode of Life as a, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.